And we're live.
Good evening. I'm Susan Smith Richardson, CEO of the Center for Public Integrity. And thank you for your patience as we do our second online event. Technology is our friend, but sometimes it feels awfully challenging to get everything going. So thank you for your patience. I also want to thank you for joining us tonight, along with the SNCC Legacy Project, for what I know will be a rich conversation about defending the vote. So a couple of quick ground rules. I am hearing somebody's speaker in the background, so I'm going to ask them to mute their phone so I can hear clearly. Beautiful. Okay. Thank you for joining Public Integrity and the SNCC Legacy Project for what I know is going to be a rich conversation about defending the vote. What can I say? The 2020 election promises to be one for the history books. I am not the first person to say it and certainly won't be the last. Americans are going to the polls against the backdrop of a pandemic and longstanding policies and court decisions that could affect voter turnout, as well as a national reckoning about racial justice, anti-Black violence, and policing. In the next few weeks, the Center for Public Integrity, in partnership with Pew Institute Stateline, is going to launch a database and a series of stories on polling place closures and its impact on voices in the election. So I want you to stay tuned for that as we move forward with that project. I will give a shameless plug for that a little bit later in our conversation. And I'm also going to ask our reporter, Carrie Levine, to feel free to chime in the chat room with more details about our project. But I want to make up for a little time that we've lost already in getting ourselves online. So a couple of quick ground rules for you all. I'm going to start with a few questions to our panelists, but we want your questions as well. So please ask them in Crowdcast under the Ask a Question tab. Isn't that fabulously simple? And I promise that we're going to get to your questions during our hour-long conversation. So thanks again for being here with us. So we're calling tonight's conversation, Eyes Still on the Prize. And I want to emphasize the still question, because there's a long bridge between past and present efforts to make sure every vote counts and to oppose voter suppression, from the poll tax to challenges right now with mail-in ballots. I can't think of a better panel to help us talk about the past and the present and to help build that bridge than the panel of women tonight who I have tremendous respect for. So I want to start with Judy Richardson. Judy was on the SNCC staff from 1963 to 1966 in Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia. Her film work includes the 14-hour Eyes on the Prize series, an award-winning series that ran on PBS, and if you are a student of civil rights history, it is must-see viewing. Through the SNCC Legacy Project, she collaborates with Duke University on the documentary website sncdigital.org and on SNCC Legacy's continuing conversations with young activists, building that bridge between foot soldiers and leaders from one generation to the other. She'll again co-direct an NEH Teacher Institute on grassroots movements in 2021. Latasha Brown. Latasha is a nationally recognized expert in Black voting rights and voter suppression, Black women's empowerment and philanthropy, and I could say many, many other things about her. She is the co-founder of Black Voters Matter, Black Voters Matter Fund, and Black Voters Matter Capacity Building Institute. These are initiatives designed to boost Black voter registration and turnout, as well as increase power in marginalized, predominantly Black communities. And Professor Sonia Jarvis. Sonia is a distinguished lecturer at the Mark School of Public and International Affairs at Baruch College, City University of New York. She's an accomplished scholar whose research and teaching focuses on race, politics, and media. She's written several books and chapters and papers, and currently is completing a book entitled Through a Prism Darkly, The Media's Impact on Race and Politics in America Since the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And in addition to all of her scholastic work, she served as the executive director of the National Coalition on Black Voter Participation. So thank you all for joining me tonight for this rich conversation. I was going to start with the bridge, but I want to instead start with the question to Sonia, and we're going to use first names here today, just to kind of help us set up the larger conversation about what we're seeing today before we turn to the past. So voter suppression has been a strategy to win elections by both political parties at different times in this country's history. The motor voter law passed in 1993 under President Clinton made it easier for people to register. But since then, we've seen many efforts to disenfranchise voters, especially Black voters, through laws and the courts. What does this mean for American democracy? I'm going to ask you to unmute. And there you are.
I'm not muted. There we go. Hello, Susan, ladies. It's an honor to be with you, and I will address Susan's question as directly as I can. How much time do I have to talk about voter suppression?
Well, we'll give you a little piece now, and the whole night is about that, so you'll have more time.
Okay. Well, it's instructive that we are meeting during the same year. We are celebrating 100 years since women could vote. I should say white women, because it took longer for Black women and other people of color to vote. It's also the 150th anniversary of the 15th Amendment, when Black men could vote but were prevented from doing so by various methods of voter suppression. So that's a beginning point for us today. Current efforts to stop people from voting, we can really trace back to the 2000 election between George Bush and Al Gore. Following that contested election, and we're expecting another contested election, so we shouldn't be surprised at current efforts to suppress the vote. But it's important for us to understand what happened in that immediate aftermath of the 2000 election. There were those who felt that there was all kinds of voter fraud, which is not a fact, has not been a fact, and is still not a fact today. But it's used as a way of scaring people into thinking that somehow voter ID was going to be the way forward. So most Americans don't mind to be asked to show their ID to vote. But what we saw in the aftermath of that last contested election is that you could use your fishing license as an ID, but you couldn't use your student ID. That made no sense unless you understand how voter suppression works. We go back in time, it was in all forms. It was, you can vote only if your grandfather voted. Okay. If you managed to get past that some way, it was, well, we want you to interpret the Mississippi Constitution. And you're asking people who had not been taught how to read, they were now being asked to interpret a constitution. If you got past that, there was the white primary that said you could only vote in the general election if you participated in the primary, and the primary was restricted by race. We have all of that as the run-up to the 60s, and Judy's going to talk more about what happened there. But the point I'm trying to make is we reached the pinnacle of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that was giving protection to those who previously did not receive it. After the 2000 presidential election, we had a Supreme Court case in 2006 that allowed voter ID to be used. Again, not the problem, but the real problem was the intent behind the changes in the laws, especially in states that were trying to restrict the Black vote and the Hispanic vote. And that came to a crescendo with the 2013 Shelby case that effectively gutted Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. Since then, over 27 states have enacted restrictive voter ID laws. Two colleagues of mine at Baruch have spent the last 3 years writing about the impact of voter ID. We hope to have a book come out soon about that. But what we've seen is that, as I said, Americans don't object to reasonable efforts to make sure you are who you say you are to vote. But this idea that fraud has crippled the process is simply a lie, and we can prove it by actual statistics. I'll put it to you this way, and then I'll say a couple more points to wrap up this section. If a foreign nation is trying to hack our voting process, the safest thing to have is a mail-in ballot because you have a piece of paper. If you're just voting by computer, it's easy to hack. If you have a mail-in ballot, we can go back and check and recheck and audit if we needed to, but we don't have that ability with certain types of voting machines. We also know how difficult it has been during this pandemic for people to actually vote in person. And so the best way I can put it is, for our democracy, we should understand that a vote by mail is the same as a vote by absentee. It just means you're not there in person. But now we have to be concerned whether or not the Postal Service is ready to do its job, given the cuts and the impediments that have been placed in the way of them doing their normal job. Aside from that, we have to worry what happens if we don't have an effective and clear result within a reasonable amount of time, which we'll get to later. But to your point about democracy, we have a choice. The choice is whether to vote or stay home. If we stay home, then we can't complain about the consequences. If we show up, we have to make sure that every vote is counted. I'll stop.
Thank you. Thank you. On this very point, and especially on the point of voter fraud, I want to go to Latasha. Yesterday, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution had a story that said the Secretary of State there announced that about 1,000 Georgians face investigation for voting twice in the state's June 9th primary. It is a large-scale allegation of fraud 8 weeks before Election Day. These voters returned absentee ballots and then showed up at polling places on Election Day, the Secretary of State said. Double voting is a felony in Georgia. Latasha, I know Black Voters Matter responded to what the Secretary of State said. Tell me about your response in that case.
So our response is twofold. One, thank you for having me, Susan. I think the response is twofold. One, a couple of days prior, on Friday, actually, there was a report that came out with ACLU that actually documented that there were over 200,000 eligible voters that were dropped from the voting rolls in Georgia. And so it's hard for me to believe that our Secretary of State is so concerned about this 1,000 votes, but he's not concerned about 200,000 votes. This is all a part of a political ploy and strategy around to really be able to undermine this process and creating this idea of there's this lack of integrity and this voter fraud. No, what you saw is you saw incompetence. The bottom line is that his job as the Secretary of the State was to track the ballots. And had the Secretary of State office tracked the ballots, they would be aware of who had already voted already. So this falls squarely in his lap. He had one job and he failed miserably at it. In addition to that, he is also a part of this larger piece. We've got to really talk about what this is about, right? We, particularly in this conversation of voter fraud, I know there are people that have probably talked about it and heard about it, but let's really talk about what this is about. This isn't about participation. This is about power. Ultimately, it's to the extent around that America is shifting. The political landscape, the demographics are shifting. As America becomes browner, what we are seeing is we're seeing elected officials to pick up the playbook that those of us that work in the South, and I can't wait to literally be able to talk and hear from Judy, because I am a fan of her work and a student of both she and Sonia's work around the work that they did in laying the foundation in the state of which I'm a native from, of Alabama. But if you literally look at what's happening right now, it is the playbook for the Southern strategy. It's a couple of things. One, it is to literally create this this white nationalist environment of fear of racism that the Black people and the people of color are getting ready to take over and they're taking your homes. That's one. The second thing is it's also been an element of how do you create an environment and a culture of fear and intimidation. Right. And so part of what we see from the highest office of this land, including from President Trump's office, is that this idea of putting this fear of intimidation. And I think the third piece is this also creating this process where you're distorting the process, where there are polling places that are closed, that you're actually physically creating barriers to prevent people from voting. We see that in Georgia. So the Secretary of State has a lot of nerves, who ran the absolute worst election in the history, probably of this country, but in the history of the state, certainly, to now all of a sudden say that he is going to prosecute at the fullest extent of the law. This is another political ploy to make people be fearful, for folks to not participate in the process, particularly as voting as a real option. And three, it also is indicative to the failure of he and his own incompetence in serving it, whether it's intentional or unintentional. The bottom line is he is incompetent to serve in that way. And he, quite frankly, when he saw the numbers, he should have resigned immediately.
What are you doing there in the state to work around this, to overcome this? What are your challenges to this?
Well, we're doing a couple of things. We're suing, we're organizing, right? And we're getting folks ready and moving them to the polls. And so there has to be a multiple strategy, because like I said, we're not talking about participation, we're talking about power. And if we really learn the history and know the history of how voter suppression has always been, I would even go quicker, that voter suppression has been ever since that Black folks were brought on the shores of this country, that ultimately that our own humanity was suppressed. That even when you're talking about the voting rights movement and the civil rights movement in Selma, Alabama, when I talk to leaders and mentors who are part of that movement, it wasn't about the vote, it was about their humanity, to the extent that their vote was actually a key of their agency, them absolutely using their agency to actually be able to create and put people in office and take folk out that had created harm for them. But so I do think we have to center the conversation. But what we are doing is we sue the state of Georgia. We've been suing the state of Georgia. We're also in a lawsuit currently right now. Matter of fact, my co-partner is actually on trial as we speak in Alabama, because we're suing the state of Alabama, because what they're doing is now, instead of expanding the process around absentee ballot voting, which we already know is in the midst of a pandemic, you're asking people, they're sticking with this absentee ballot process that requires 2 witnesses and a notary. Who can find a notary and 2 witnesses in the midst of us having the largest health pandemic in the last 100 years? And so we're actually suing them to actually break in having free and fair access to the ballot. So there's one level around always having a legal strategy and working with some of our legal partners around that. The second piece is what we know to work and to organize in our community is to do just that, to organize. And so we've been organizing and educating. And so we actually have a multiple level of campaigns. We're doing canvassing throughout the state. We have caravans, because we're not going door to door, which we normally do. We have caravans going throughout the state where we have QR codes. We're using technology. We have QR codes that we're actually putting on magnets on the side of the cars, where you can just put up your telephone and take a picture and pop up. You'll go straight to our site where you can check your status, whether you're registered, and you can actually register to vote right there. And you can find out where it is you are to vote. So we're actually using technology as a leverage in that way. We're also layering it while talking to folks and having virtual town hall meetings. We've been having trainings. Every Thursday, we're having a training basically on how do you vote. This is the first time in 25 years of me doing this work that I've gotten a number of calls of people saying, I don't know how to vote this election. And part of that is not reflective of them, it's reflective of the effectiveness of what this racist president has done, which is to create this whole idea of confusion, and people are not sure. And so our job as organizers are to actually be able to give folks the information and to also help advise them and shepherd them through the process. And the third and the last thing is, with Black Voters Matter, we're actually empowering community grassroots groups. We think that where power is not from the top down, it's from the bottom up. And so what we are doing, we will be supporting, and we're currently organizing hundreds of Black-led grassroots groups in 11 states around this country, that at least 20 to 25 organizations that we're actually investing, putting dollars in, that we're actually giving them tools like text messaging and be able to do phone banking. And we're also doing radio ads. We are doing everything we can to literally push for a high voter turnout, because this is not an election just about two political candidates. This is an election about the Democrats and Republicans. We are literally talking about fascism, and we're literally talking about the unraveling of democracy. And we've got to be honest and bold and courageous enough to call it what it is, because what we're talking about is we're literally talking about the lives of our people, and we're no longer going to want to be a pawn in this political game where our people are left without any support. When you're talking about the unraveling of democracy, those of us that live in the Deep South, we know what that looks like.
So I want to come back to many of the points that you just raised in that broad context. So I'm going to go back and to talk to Judy about building the bridge. Then I want to come back and pick up on some of the points, Latasha, that you're talking about organizing. One of the rich things about this conversation is being able to look at the connection between the past and the present. And Judy's experience, both as a SNCC staffer and as someone who was a series producer for Eyes on the Prize, has given her both a front row seat, but also an ability to have conversations with a number of folks who were on the ground doing the voting work in the 1960s. So, Judy, I want to ask you, what are the parallels that you see between what is happening now and what you experienced on the ground as a SNCC staffer in the 60s in Mississippi and Alabama? There you are. You need to unmute.
Okay, sorry, I'm not sure what to do here. Let's try this. Can you still hear me?
Yes, you're great now. Thank you.
Okay. I'm used to Zoom, so I'm not sure what the problem might be here. Can you still hear me? Okay. I have no idea what the problem is. Okay.
I'm getting a little feedback from you. I'm going to have Christine help you for a second, and then I'm going to go to a couple of questions from our participants, and then I'll come back to you. So if you'll put it on mute, I'll ask Christine to help you with a couple of the technical issues. So I want to focus on a couple of questions while Judy works on some of the technical issues. Let me look at this one. For those journalists who work, and this is for both Sonia and for Latasha, for those journalists who work in states that are not considered battleground states and are considered safe for the incumbents, what roles can they play to defend the election and protect voting rights? Do I need to read that question again? Okay. And Sonia, this is for both you and Latasha.
Okay. Well, we see from the most recent contested elections that predictions about which states are actually going to be the swing states is not always accurate. So let's not fall into that trap again. Remember what was supposed to happen in 2016? That did not happen. I hear some feedback still. Let's see.
Does everybody have their mic off? All of the panelists have their mics muted. And Judy does. Let's try again, Sonia.
No problem. If nothing else, we should tell journalists in every state, just tell the truth. Make sure people have good information about what are the election-related deadlines, whether it's early voting, whether it's mail-in, whether it's in person. That's going to be critical going forward. Okay, that's number one. Number two, let's not believe the polls necessarily. What happened last time? People believed the polls and felt, oh, I don't need to go out. This is done. I'd say this is the time. If you've never voted before, you should make sure you take that time now. But beyond that, I think that journalists across the country need to call out, whether it's an elected official or those who are on local television who are not telling the truth about the election process in their state. And one of the things that we've been talking to you about is how the center can help get that information out nationwide, whether it's on your website, through webinars like this, so that people know exactly when they can early vote. And my advice is the first day you can do it, you should do it. Don't wait till the last day. Same for your mail-in ballot. As soon as you receive it, send it back. If you're going in person, go as early as you can to reduce your risk. These are things that journalists can tell the public what to do to protect their vote and to protect themselves.
So following in what Sonia raised, I'll just say a couple of things. One, I want to challenge and push back a little bit on the framing. I think that journalists have a responsibility to really be able to frame this in a broader context around democracy. When we talk about battleground, then there is, for some communities, it is all of the states, all elections, as far as I see it, are battleground, right? We do know within the context of presidential politics that there are some states, because of the Electoral College, are considered as battleground, but we also have some critical Senate seats that are up in Georgia and Alabama and Tennessee, South Carolina, Mississippi, and other states, that is a battleground where we're talking about not just the White House, but we're also talking about there are some critical battles that are going on, particularly in local and state elections in some of these other states. The second thing, and so I think that it's really important for us to frame that what is important, even what we learn in Poli-Sci 101, is that all politics are local. That ultimately, while there is a presidential and national election, that when we're looking at some of the issues that we're talking about right now, particularly in the largest uprising in this country with the Black Lives Matter, that fundamentally that is going to be resolved. There's going to be a national component, but where that gets resolved is locally. That is the police chiefs that are elected locally. That is the city council that appoints the police chiefs and some communities. And so what we've got to do is not marginalize the fact that we're talking in this election cycle, while there is a presidential election, which of course the national media is really focused on, that there are some critical Senate races and some critical local races and state races as well. The second thing I think is really important is that we have to literally be able to, we are in, as I raised, that there is a culture of fear. A fear and intimidation and confusion. This idea of like the standard of creating chaos, that's intentional. And that is intentional to be able to create apathy. I think what we don't see enough on the media, we don't see enough, that there are tons of organizations like mine and others that are doing kick-ass work every day, that we're actually out there organizing, beating the grounds. We need, what journalists have a responsibility to do is to really be able to tell a balanced story. And so I think that there's also an opportunity to lift up the work of organizations and groups that are sitting on the forefront that may not necessarily be connected to the political parties, but they're literally fighting for democracy. Some of the ones that I see who are fighting for democracy more than anybody are nonprofit Black grassroots groups and progressive groups that are on the ground, but you don't see a lot about the work. And so the national narrative that lends the day is this man, this man who is in office, Trump, who has all of this amass of power, and we don't know if we can beat him. What do we mean we can't beat him? The bottom line is, at best, he only got 20% of the population, because if you look, because 40% of people are not even voting in the election cycle. So when you look at the numbers are literally on our side in terms of progressive, a multicultural, multiracial generation. But part of what happens is when we're feeding into this narrative that it is just this one-sided power dynamic, and we're not balancing that to show how people are resisting and how people are gaining ground, then I think that we fall into this trap that we're falling in. And I think the third and the last thing is that while it is very important that journalists are covering stories about voter suppression and covering stories about some of the
We're frozen for a quick second. I hope that Latasha will unfreeze in a moment, and then we're going to try Judy again. I think that we're going to try Judy again and see if we can go back to the question we asked earlier. Okay. And then we're going to come back to Latasha and hopefully hear
critical. I can watch the news and not really reckon the work and the critical issues that people are working and organizing around.
Latasha, we lost you for a minute and lost a bit of what you were saying toward the end. I can't hear you to wrap up what you were saying. I'm going to go to Judy, then I'm going to come back to you again. Okay. So, Judy, I want to go back to talking about that bridge between the past and the present and parallels that you're seeing between your experience in the South as a member of SNCC and what Latasha has been talking about earlier. Let's see if this will work this time. And I'm going to need for you to unmute.
Okay.
I can hear you clearly.
And I thought I was on mute. Fantastic. Okay. All right. Let me just give a little bit of history for this. And this is in terms of what we are, how we are schooled. And the only problem I'm getting is that I have a lot of feedback through my headphones. So I don't know whether they can do. Okay. I'm just going to keep talking and try not to think about all this feedback I'm getting. Okay.
We can hear you very clearly if that's any help.
Can you still hear me?
Absolutely.
Okay, that's fine. I'm just going to talk and not worry about hearing myself. Okay. So the main thing for me is that we are schooled by the folks who came before us. So for example, when, and Bob Moses told me this. Bob Moses, many of you know as, MacArthur Genius Grant awardee and head of the Algebra Project. But for us, you can't hear me? Okay. Okay, some can, but some can't. Okay. Should I keep talking or should I not?
I can hear you clearly, Judy. So please go on.
Okay, that's fine then. Okay. So what Bob Moses says to us is what Bob Moses says to me, and this is at an advisor meeting for Eyes on the Prize, right? And he says, well, one of the things that I learned, one of the real people I learned from was Amzie Moore. And he says, in 1961, 62, we were still in SNCC, still talking about sit-ins, because we were the only youth group, youth-led organization within the Southern movement that was national. And we're the combination of all the sit-in movements. So what Bob says is, look, when I go down to Mississippi initially in 61, 62, I am trying to get young people to come back as sit-in folks, representatives to participate in SNCC. But again, we're still talking about nonviolent demonstrations, public accommodations. But Miss Baker, who was our North Star, Miss Baker is this primo organizer, former head of branches for the NAACP, director of first executive director for SCLC, Dr. King's organization. And so Bob says to me, he says, and so what happened is that Miss Baker says, well, if you want some folks in Mississippi, you need to contact Amzie Moore because Amzie's part of her network. And so Bob goes in and talks to Amzie. Amzie at that point is head of something called the Regional Council of Negro Leadership. These are returning World War II veterans like Lamar Smith and Medgar Evans and many of those. And so Amzie sits Bob down. Bob is staying with Amzie and his family. And Amzie pulls out a precinct map and says, look, these are where Black folks are concentrated within the Mississippi Delta and in Southwest Mississippi. He said, this is where we are. He said, now you young people can do sit-ins if you want to. But he said, I know that our power, back to Latasha's point, our power as Black people will be around the right to vote. So he says, I'm not ready for you here. This is Amzie Moore saying, I'm not ready for you in terms of my organization here in Cleveland, Mississippi, but CC Bryant is ready for you. Again, part of Ms. Baker's network, part of his network, CC Bryant is ready for you in Macomb, Mississippi. And so Bob then goes, and that's the first voter registration drive in Mississippi. Now, Regional Council of Negro Leadership, I did not know it. When I'm sitting there in Mississippi in 1964, those three particular civil rights workers were missing. We all knew they were dead, Cheney, Goodman, and Schwerner. I'm sitting there in Greenwood. We moved the national office down to Greenwood, Mississippi. And routinely, Black residents would point to this guy and say, that's Byron D. Beckwith. That's the man that killed Medgar Evers, who was the NAACP leader, killed on the day, August 28th, that ends up being later the March on Washington Day. And so a lot of us in SNCC, when we go to the March on Washington, understand that Medgar has just been killed, right? Just a few weeks before. AMSI says, this is, our power is going to be around that. But I didn't know any of that. I didn't know about Regional Council of Negro Leadership when I'm down there, right? I find out about that when I'm working on Eyes on the Prize, because Bob Moses had talked to us as a production team, but also I did the interview for what becomes Eyes on the Prize with AMSI Moore. And AMSI says to me, well, you know, we had this group and we had 15, 20,000 Black people together in Mississippi, in Mount Bayou, Mississippi. 15 to 20 Black folks, 1951, 52. And I'm thinking, you know, oh, poor AMSI, you know, he must be demented, because I know what we went through in the mid 1960s. I mean, people were killing us and beating us because what we're trying to do is get Black people registered to vote without getting them killed. How do you get them registered to vote without getting them killed? And so AMSI says this to me, and I'm thinking, oh, you know, poor child, you know, he's lost it. Come a couple years later, and I'm talking to one of the local scholars, John Dittmer. And I say, you know, John, I was talking to AMSI Moore a couple of years ago when we first started Eyes, and he talked about this gathering. And John Dittmer says to me, well, yeah, that's true. That's the Regional Council of Negro Leadership. And yeah, they have 15, 20,000 people, and they're talking about voter rights, economic parity, police brutality, getting more income for Black businesses. Congressman Diggs comes down from Detroit. You know, they have all of these things, and they're doing it in Mount Bayou, Mississippi, which is the all-Black town in Mississippi. And so you get this through line of Black folks understanding the importance of the vote. Not that it's the only thing that you do. You always organize, you always hold people accountable, but it's one of those things that one of our folks, Cortland Cox, always talks about as being necessary but not sufficient. But it is necessary, because without it, we don't have all that money that the Koch brothers have, right? One of the great equalizers, if we use it, one, is the vote. And so one of the things that we understood, because of all these local organizers, like Mrs. Hamer, like Mrs. Blackwell, like all of these people who are schooling us when we go in, Mrs. Boynton and Selma, all these folks who had been working for the vote since the 1940s, you know, that's who we pat on ourselves after.
So, Judy, for people who don't know who Mrs. Hamer is, we're having some serious technology problems at this point. Tell folks, well, let's start with Ella Baker. I don't want to assume that everybody who's listening knows who Miss Baker is, but tell them who Ella Baker is and what her relationship was with SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And then hopefully we're going to be able to get LaTosha back. All right. Okay. Thank you.
So the importance of, I'm going to take this off because I can't hear with them on. The importance of Ms. Baker is that Ms. Baker is the one, and you can find wonderful profiles of all the folks I'm talking about on SNCC Digital, SNCC, SNCCdigital.org, but there's a profile of her. And the importance of Ms. Baker is that she, when all these sit-in groups, you know, Nashville movement with Diane Nash and John Lewis and Marion Barry and the Atlanta movement with Julian Bond, and I mean, they're going all over the place with these coming out of the Black colleges, right? Sit-ins all over the place. Ms. Baker, being this consummate organizer, but grassroots organizer, what she says to Dr. King, because at that point, she is temporary executive secretary of this new Southern Christian Leadership Conference, Black ministers. And so she says to Dr. King, we need to bring all these young people together so that they can start talking to one another, see how they can help each other. And so we get about $750 from SCLC. And that first organizing conference happens because of Ms. Baker, who had been formerly a support person for the Montgomery bus boycott, had been organizing in the 40s, milk co-ops in Harlem, and then she's the director of branches for the NAACP. So, but always talking about grassroots leadership. So she knows all the folks who are really plowing the ground at the grassroots. So she says to him, she says to Dr. King, we need to get them together. He gives her the money. And so she sends out these notices to the leadership, men, women from these Black colleges, come to Shaw University, her college in North Carolina, in Raleigh, North Carolina in 1960. And so all these folks come in, Julian, as I said, Julian Bond's coming in from Atlanta, Diane Nash and John Lewis are coming in from Nashville, all these folks coming in. And what she says at that conference is, we need to be about more than just a hamburger. It has to be about the ability to buy the hamburger. Because the point is, it's not like you want to just, get yourself killed in order to be able to sit next to a white person at a sit-in. That's not the point. The point is that you have the right to sit wherever you want to. And the other point that she was making is, it has to be about more than just integrating this lunch counter. You have to talk about economic development. And always she's talking about it in terms of community-wide. It's not some people should be really wealthy and some people should be really poor. Her idea always was that it is a community basis on which you organize. So when you see on SNCC Digital, for example, you see people who, Chuck McDew, who talk about coming to that first conference, and they say, well, Chuck, for example, is at Orangeburg at that point, South Carolina State. And he says, we got this leaflet that said that somebody named Miss Baker was calling us to be, to come to this conference. He said, well, I didn't know Miss Baker. But he said, what I did is I went to my pastor in Orangeburg, South Carolina. And he said, I said, do you know who this Miss Baker is? The pastor says, I know Miss Baker well, and you can trust anything she says. Because Miss Baker had this network of grassroots leadership all up and down the South, all up and down, actually from New York all the way down to Florida. So all of these folks come together. But what's most important is that she has this network like Amzie Moore, like she stays with Rosa Parks when she's in Montgomery. But she also understood the international part of the struggle. So one of her last speeches is in favor of Puerto Rican solidarity. She had allies like Ann and Carl Braden, who were white allies. She put us in touch. She knew organizing, but she also knew strategy. So when we're doing the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party in Mississippi, she is one of the main strategy people. And she gives the keynote at that Jackson convention in 1964, where she says, don't just elect politicians, Black or white, and think that you can let them go. She said, because you always have to hold their feet to the fire. Miss Baker is saying that at the Jackson Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party convention in 1964. And she's saying it to Mrs. Hamer, to Mrs. Blackwell, to Amzie Moore, to all of the folks who were gathered, who were part of this delegation to try and stop the all-white delegation from the Democratic Party that's going to Atlantic City in 1964 at that point. But I would just mention one other thing, and this is separate from Miss Baker. When we organize, and it has to do with the Democratic Party, when we're organizing in Alabama, in Lowndes County, the official Alabama Democratic Party logo, Democratic Party logo has a white rooster, and it says white supremacy for the right, which is why we get the Black Panther when we're organizing this independent Black Party. So all of that is to say, we understood the vote was really necessary, but not sufficient.
It's a really interesting point. I want to bring up a couple of things for folks who are looking in the chat room, so you're aware of this. We have been having links to the SNCC Digital Gateway project, but also links to some of our stories at the Center for Public Integrity. And I want to mention a story, in fact, that Carrie Levine has flagged in the chat room, which does mention kind of to a point that Latasha raised earlier with the question about what journalists can do. In a story today, we did highlight the work of Cleveland Votes, which is a grassroots organization working to engage folks in voter participation. So I want to direct you to our site and to some of the stories we've done, but also to really look at some of those links that we're sharing and use them as resources. So
and
I know that.
I'm sorry. Can I just say one thing? I noticed something, just a little mistake in the chat room where it says Miss Baker said in 1958. Actually, she says because, well, she says it in 1964. And what she says is, until the murders of a white woman's son is worth the murders of a black woman's son, we will not be free. And she says that at that Jackson, Mississippi convention in 1964 that I referenced, where she gives the keynote. And at that point, of course, we have not found the three: James Chaney, Mickey Schwerner, and Andy Goodman. We haven't found them, but we know that they are dead. She says that in the midst of that.
Thank you for bringing up that point. Two things I want to ask you in a follow-up, and I'm hoping that LaTosha can rejoin us, because I think these are relevant to what she said about organizing now. And then I want to pivot out of the South and talk a little bit more nationally about voting issues and other groups that are affected by many of the things that are happening right now. But kind of a quick follow-up to really make this point, because Judy, you and I have talked about this before, and I've talked to other SNCC veterans about this, and this parallel with organizing today. And two things you've already mentioned, that the idea was to build movements that were leader-full, meaning that there were many leaders, not a singular leader, and movements that were, can you hear me?
I'm not quite hearing you. I'm getting a lot of back.
Okay. So yeah. I'm going to start over again to make sure you could hear what I was saying.
That's good.
One thing I have talked to you about in the past and with other SNCC veterans is two things that have really been emphasized in your experience. One is building movements, whether it's a movement for voting rights or civil rights, movements that are leader-full, not just about a single charismatic leader. And also the importance of, as you have implied, in the work going into Mississippi by SNCC, it is listening to the people who are already there, learning from the people who are on the ground and have already done the organizing. So are there any other parallels just in terms of the organizing work that you are seeing playing out now? And certainly this is something that LaTosha could also talk to if she rejoins us. And then I want to start talking about some of the other issues that are not playing out in the South across the country with voting. So let me let you talk about that, then we're going to go to Sonia.
Okay. Yeah, I think one of the things, and I should say that we have been in a lot of conversation with young activists since about 2015. And so just hung up, was in a conversation in a meeting with Nsé Ufot, who is New Georgia, and who mentioned this article that you talked about, and Diatra, who is head of BYP 100, and just a lot of young activists. And so what I see, and I'm going to have to take this off because it's driving me crazy. What you see is this understanding that you're not just bringing your agenda to the community where you live. I mean, part of the thing to understand is when we're organizing in Mississippi, Georgia, Southwest Georgia, Alabama, Arkansas, we're living in the community. You know, sometimes we have freedom houses, but most of the time we're living with local community people who are guiding and oftentimes guarding us. And we have to do that because we're only making $10 a week, you know, which was $9.64 after taxes. But the main thing was, we are not going in saying, this is our agenda and we expect you to organize around it. We're listening. We are, you know, I mean, Bob Moses talks about sitting on somebody's porch and listening and letting them get to know Bob or Ivanhoe or Charlie or Muriel Tillinghast, any of the folks, because they're entrusting their lives with you. I mean, at that point, you really were. In the same way that if you go back to the colored conventions, you know, before slavery, they're talking about the right to vote. You know, you go all the way back to these people. We understood that it wasn't the be all end all, but if you don't have that, you don't have nothing. So what Bob's understood, though, was because they're trusting not only their lives and livelihoods of themselves and their family, but their entire communities. So you didn't do anything that would endanger that. You know, for example, when I mentioned that Byron D. Beckwith, you know, that they're pointing to this man when I'm in Greenwood in 1964 and saying, you know, that's the man killed Medgar Evers. Well, they knew that, but they also knew that if they offed him, that the entire power of the state would come down on them. There were times when people would be chasing us, right? Stokely talks about going to Hartman Turnbow's place. And Hartman Turnbow didn't play nonviolent. You know, he had a farm. You knew if you got anywhere near Hartman Turnbow's farm, you were safe because he had a shotgun and he knew how to use it. Self-defense, not, it was totally self-defense. But we also knew with that if you did anything that called the power of the state down before you got your objective one, which was getting Black people registered to vote without getting them killed, then you did a disservice not to you because, you're just the organizer. The main thing is that you were doing a disservice to the community that depended on you, that was putting their lives in your hands. And so you did nothing that was going to mess up the ability of carrying through the idea of getting these folks registered, getting them organized in a way that would counter the agriculture department's racist policies to Black farm owners. It was all of that. I mean, it was economic, it was social, it was political, but the main thing was your greatest responsibility was the community in which you were organizing.
Thank you. LaTosha, can you hear me? All right, there you are. Welcome back.
I don't know what is happening. I'm like, is it Mercury retrograde? What is happening?
Yeah, I think it is. What is it, Mercury retrograde? Because I'm really feeling that. But we're going to try to press on, and hopefully we have about, everyone will stay with this about another 10 minutes. Judy was talking a lot about the organizing history of SNCC in the South. And I know you spoke early on about organizing folks to turn out the vote. The first time I heard you speak was in Chicago, and I think you said at that event, this was about 2 years ago, I saw you in person, and then you burst into song, which was beautiful. And I'm probably going to ask you to sing us out at the end of this conversation. So get ready. But before, one of the things you said stood with me, and it was that there is not a red South. And I'm not saying this to be a partisan because I'm not. There is not a red South. There is an unorganized South. Yes. So we've got kind of a two-part question here. And I've read many of the op-eds that you've written for the New York Times about organizing efforts in the South. But right now, you're not just organizing around the vote and dealing with lawsuits and various things we talked about in Georgia and other states. You're also organizing in the context of a pandemic, which is a different way of organizing. So talk to me about how you're organizing during a pandemic and how those challenges are affecting the way you would go about trying to register people to vote.
Thank you for asking me. It is certainly a new challenge to organize in the midst of where you can't. I mean, part of the power of organizing is the touch, is to actually be able to connect directly with people. And that's what we're known for. What we're known for is literally being on the ground and being able to connect. I think what is a value, though, I will say that what has worked in our favor is I'm not new to this. We're not new to this. And what I mean by that is we're coming in 2020 with a set of relationships. So we didn't just start today because it was an election cycle. That's the value of organizing ongoing. We've been talking about our work organizing 365 days out of the year. I'm raising that because now what we've had to do is, because we can't door-to-door organize, we have to do more relational organizing where we're actually talking and connecting with our groups that are connected to their folks. So while we can't go door to door, I was always been a critic of that work, that when there is, a lot of times what I think part of the reason why we named our organization Black Voters Matter, not Black Votes Matter, because there's a whole bunch of people that care about Black votes and not Black voters. And so what we would see is 2 or 3 weeks right outside of an election, I would call it the round the Negroes up, that there would be this flood of folks that would go to the doors to round Black folk up to vote, right? But not necessarily to be a relationship that we're doing long-term organizing. That's very different. Mobilizing and organizing are very different, right? One should lend itself to the other, but we do need to be able to make that distinction. And part of what happens is, even we've seen these efforts where these folks that we don't know, that come to our communities, they go door to door, people never see them again, and that's that's it. That is not how we operate. The way we operate is that we literally are rooting ourselves in community and organizations, Black-led grassroots groups. Some of them do civic engagement groups. Some of them are doing prison reform. Some of them are actually working to free political prisoners. Some of them are doing work around health access. And my point is, those organizations that are going to be there embedded in those communities, the part of the way that we've had to do our work is actually tap into those organizations and really be able to creative to leverage relationships. We've had to rely a lot on technology. And a couple of ways that we've done, we've actually had virtual town halls. You know, it's interesting because on one hand, I miss being able to connect with folks directly. But on the other hand, I have to acknowledge that many of our town halls, where we would normally have 75 to 100 people, we've had up 300 to 1,000 people register all over the state because transportation is no longer a barrier. And so we're able in many ways to be able to get information out broader, but because of technology and because of people are online all day, we've got to layer it. And so what we've been doing is literally being able to layer information because we don't have the face-to-face contact in the same way. And so some of the ways we've been doing it is, like I said, using the virtual spaces. We do a lot of Zooms. I call us Zoomies. We've done a lot of Zooms where we've done virtual town halls in each of our states. We also have weekly calls at each of our states. We have a call with our partners. We work with 20 to 25 Black-led organizations. They have a monthly call that they're getting on where they're sharing information. They're sharing what areas are covered, what areas are not covered. In addition to that, we're also layering it with information through. That's why we do a lot of writing, that in the midst of all our other organizing, we're writing op-eds, we're writing articles, we're actually sending out text messaging. Right now, we're actually texting, I think, 500,000 Black voters that we identified and targeted in the state of Georgia, really just to be able to send a link for them to check their status and to literally be able to get in contact with us if they have a problem with that. We're also using radio. That oftentimes we said there's an air war and there's a ground war, and you have to look at how you utilize those. What people who are political organizers and operatives know, that Black people normally, where we're looking at in terms of politically where we get our message, is not necessarily TV. It's actually the radio. And so we've invested a lot of energy, a lot of time and resources on literally doing interviews on the radio to talk about what it means to vote. We've also embedded in all that we're doing, because voting in many ways is a traumatic experience for us. You know, that sounds weird, but it is. Like, you got to go through hell to vote in many of these places. I had to stand in line for 3 hours. We went to, on this last election cycle, I got a phone call on my way to bed at 10:30. I just got off the Lawrence O'Donnell show, and I got a phone call that there were hundreds of Black folks still in line at a polling place in Union City, Georgia. Our team went out there. The last voter left at 12:37 a.m. on Wednesday, right? And so we are looking at egregious acts. You know, what was interesting is, and so in that work, we also will have teams that are going to the polling places so that can actually encourage folks, to give them information, to advocate for them on the spot. In addition to that, we also have been doing a lot of information of, because it is, like I said, a traumatic experience, how do we create and generate Black joy? That in the midst of this is really about us standing in our power, and not standing in our power that we're begging anybody for anything. No, we're demanding that we're operating our agency, and we're making decisions around reducing the harm in our community, right? And at least getting people that on some level will align with an agenda that we think is best for our community. But in that process, we're also talking to people about power. That we literally want to shift the conversation, that the conversation isn't just about the politics of the moment, but about power. And so we've also been having series of other conversations of other issues to really engage people in innovative ways. So we're using everything in our toolbox to really be able to do three things. One, to really encourage folks, to engage them. And even in the Black Joy piece, we've had entertainers from Bobby Rush and Mississippi. If anybody's a blues fan, you know who Bobby Rush is. And so we've had Avery Sunshine. We've had what's her name? Several. I'm drawing a blank right now, but we've had several artists. We're even having a hip hop summit in 2 weeks, where we'll have Chuck D, we'll have Dr. Cornel West, we'll have Soledad O'Brien is facilitating, and we'll have Michael Eric Dyson and Damon Dash and others and YG that are participating in that process, we're using everything available in our community to really be able to do three things. One, to educate people on the process so that we can actually combat the fear, that literally we remind people of their agency and their power. And so that's why our campaign is called We Got Power Campaign. We're not asking for power. We're saying we've got power. We want to utilize it, and we're not leaving anything on the table.
Thank you. I want to shift to Sonia as we begin to kind of move to wrap up. We're now at 6:40. I've asked for a little more grace time, so 5 more minutes. Sonia, I want to pull back and look more, and thank you, Latasha, look more at structure. We've talked a lot tonight. Of course, we've been focused on Black voters on the South, and, we know the famous saying, if, and I believe it's in the Combahee River Collective, if we get free, everybody gets free. So there's the whole conversation about Black people at the center of democracy, and democracy's advance has been historically on the backs of Black folks advancing our democracy. And that's really the core theme of the 1619 project that the New York Times did. So I'm giving them a quick plug. But here's a larger question that I want to talk about before we move out of this conversation. We've talked a lot about the Black vote, but we know that there are other groups and communities that are disenfranchised in the system. So talk to me a little bit about other groups. This isn't, of course, just a regional issue in the South. It's a national issue that affects African Americans, but many other communities. I'm thinking very specifically about Indigenous communities. So talk to us a little bit more about disenfranchisement in a broader sense related to class and other groups.
Sure. Thank you, Susan. We start with the fact that a lot of people don't realize that the Voting Rights Act also covered other marginalized groups, like the Native community, like Latinos, and beyond. And so we're seeing, as part of this effort of voter suppression, directed actions against those groups. So, for example, in North Dakota, there was a law passed saying you can't receive election information by mail. You cannot register to vote if you don't have a house address, a number on your house. And here, this was intended to disenfranchise Indigenous folks who did not have house numbers on their abodes. Okay, that's just one example. We can go to Dodge City, Kansas, that had one polling place, and they were efforts to prevent Latino voters from voting in Dodge City. So they moved the single polling place out of town and off the bus route so that you couldn't get there if you didn't have transportation. There's just one example, the class issue, the race issue in the context of suppression. Beyond that, we had a case in Ohio where, contrary to existing law, a man was purged because he had not voted in the prior election. This goes all the way to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court says, oh, that's okay. We don't mind if he's found unable now to participate in the voting process. That's purging. Why should it matter? No one says you have to vote every time. We don't have a mandatory rule when it comes to voting like Australia and some other places. But here, he didn't vote. He said he didn't receive the notice trying to confirm his address, and yet the Supreme Court upheld that rule in Ohio. We can look at every major state that's in this conversation outside of the South, and there have been efforts to not allow people to take common sense measures so that people can be safe during a pandemic. The Supreme Court has ruled against every single one of those, okay, to date. So we can't expect the court to help us in this instance. Uh-oh, there we go.
I'm going to mute and see if that helps.
You're good, okay. I can hear okay. But beyond that, I think it's important for us to look at the actions that other groups have done to step forward in this historical moment to say, let's make it possible for people to vote. So the NBA has stepped up. LeBron James and others have made it possible that stadiums can now be polling places. Now, of course, that means a transportation issue. For some, they might not be able to get to that place, but it's better than not having a polling place at all, given the amount of closure of polling places across the country. We look at that. We look at the fact that one of the high watermarks with respect to voting was the passage of the National Voter Registration Act. But guess what? It was relying on people interacting with public offices. What happens if public offices like the motor vehicle department are closed? You can't get your license and register at the same time, right? There was also the fear that the push for the real ID was going to further suppress the vote. And lo and behold, this president decided, oh, let's wait on making that mandatory. I think we can figure out why he might have decided to back off. But at the same time, we can look at other national efforts that are going on now that are important to not only the African American community, but every American, and that's the census. On top of everything else, we've got a census going on, and this administration tried to stop the census. Well, a federal court said, no, you cannot do that. We're going to have it go its normal time. There's a hearing now set for September 17th. We'll have to see what happens, because the administration said stop the count by the end of September. Okay? Why is that important? Well, we also know from the type of activities you've heard described here that organizers were also trying to get people to fill out their census form. Nationwide, right now, we're only at 62.1%. I mean, that's pitiful. And we only have, at best, 2 months to just over 2 months to go before the process is closed. So let's make sure that as part of this last push to encourage all communities to participate in this election, but especially those who have been marginalized, we have to emphasize the census along with voting. We also have to be concerned about our young people. They've also been locked out of the process through ridiculous rules around what type of ID is appropriate. Before, you could use your student ID. Now, you can't in most places. But that takes us back to the beginning where you started us. What do we know about efforts to suppress the vote? We know that when the Constitution was formed, it was not intended to allow us to vote, whether we're talking about Black women or a number of other groups. It took time, effort, and protest to change that fact. At the same time, we can also look at the Electoral College. That was another effort as part of the anti-Black provisions of the Constitution to make sure that there was yet another way to stop the popular vote. It wasn't just about Black people. It was also about poor people at that time. So we've got class issues, we've got regional issues, we have national issues that are all coming together at the same time. And yet, at the root of it is the question of how can we vote? How can we vote safely? And how can we make sure our vote is counted in a reasonable period of time so that certain people can't get it into their heads that they aren't going home? Okay? And it's to that end that I think this effort and others to get the word out, to encourage people to make sure their registration is valid right now. Don't wait till the last minute, because then you'll be disappointed and upset, but make sure right now.
Thank you. I know that we are going to move to wrap up. I want to direct everybody's attention to the chat room where we're noting some stories we've written, but also we do have some links and resources for you to look at just in terms of where, if you're, calling from Illinois, which I see some of my friends from Illinois, hello to my Chicago people are on the phone, are here in this conversation talking about Illinois having Election Day as a holiday. But please look for those resources on the side. And when we follow up in an email after this event, if you didn't catch some of these resources in the chat room, we're going to send them to you in a follow-up email. I hate to end this conversation because I got 8 other questions I want to ask. That's minimum. And I think that folks have been really patient about not getting all of their questions answered. So I'm not going to leave it with my question. I'm going to leave it with this question from a very patient person out there who asks, and LaTosha, I'm going to throw this one at you. So what happens if after an election it is contested and the president who's there now decides not to move on? What do you do?
Well, the first thing I did right was the day I started to fight. Keep your eyes on the prize and hold on, hold on. You know, the whole point of this is not necessarily about a particular candidate. It is literally, what are we willing to do to fight for democracy, true democracy in this country that has never been realized. And so ultimately, we can actually talk about whether this is an issue about Trump, but this issue around voter suppression existed way before Trump. Trump is in power because there are people around him that are too coward and dishonest and racist to really own that space. And so what we are at right now is we're literally talking about, are we going to move America forward or are we going backwards? And when we're talking about him sitting in, him not refusing to move, well, the Constitution gives you instructions. The Constitution actually says that when government no longer serves you, you should replace it, repeal it, or abolish it. The bottom line is people are going to have to rise up and demand that we have a nation. If we're going to follow the nation of laws, and then it needs to be a legitimate government. If we're going to literally be able to hear and pay my hard tax dollars that I work hard for, right, then I need a legitimate government. And so fundamentally, that it will be a complete breakdown in this country. What I'd like to say to people, two things. One, I want people to take this moment right now. If you can just close your eyes and just imagine. My question to you is, imagine America without racism. Most people can't do it, because it's so embedded in the fabric of this country, right, that we can't even imagine America without racism. How is it that we're really serious about ever creating a nation without racism when we have not even imagined it? There is nothing that has been brought into existence that was not envisioned first. This cell phone, somebody had to see it in their mind first. These pens, someone had to see it in their mind first. If we are to actually see an America that really is a democracy, we've got to see it in our mind first. What that is going to require is that we radically reimagine this country, that we radically reimagine every single system that was rooted in sexism and racism and oppression. And so I don't know about you all, but I think there's an opportunity in this moment that regardless of whether he leaves or not, he's getting up out of the White House. And so what we can do is, as a community, we can demand that. And that what we can do is actually, we can hold people and our leaders accountable, and we can start by voting. But I think that it's really important for us to focus that we are willing to stand for democracy. That I don't think about what the founders thought. That ultimately the founders couldn't even see the four of us on here right now. Their insight was so limited, they couldn't even see our humanity. But what I want people to think, and how I see, is I am a founder. I am a founder of the new America. And we are founders of what will be the new nation, a nation that will be inclusive, a nation that will have equity, a nation that will treat women with respect, a nation that honors its elders and its seniors, a nation that literally the health of the economy is not based on how well the stock market is doing, but how well her people are doing. A nation that doesn't put children in cages and then we act and normalize it like it's okay because they got a different color passport. A nation that literally fundamentally creates a process so that when we work, we actually get paid fair wages for our work and we can afford to take care of our families. That is what I am envisioning. So I'm not stuck in somebody else's vision that was created in a place of limitation. What I know is that if we are to create the nation, we have an opportunity to create the nation that we all deserve. And so whether he leaves or not, he's getting up. He will know. I will say this, that in the context of him literally refusing to leave, I will not see him as a legitimate government. And I think there are millions of others just like me that will not ever. So America will certainly have not only a constitutional crisis, but it will have a people crisis.
I want to thank you. I'm going to leave that as our last word, LaTosha, and thank you. I want to say two things. I'm looking at the side and folks are saying something that's really a profound point to punctuate this conversation. It's less so about political party. It is that democracy, as my friend Sheila Solomon is saying, is a verb. It is a system and a process that voting essentially serves and protects. So I want to thank you, Latasha. I want to thank you, Judy. I want to thank you, Sonia, for making the time to be with us and for going overtime and for hanging through what's been a few technical glitches here, but what did they say? We persisted nonetheless. So I appreciate you all for that. I also want to thank the team who helped make this event possible. Christine, Alex, May, and I want to thank our reporter, Carrie Levine, who has been noting some of her stories and different information on the side. Carrie is the lead writer on our voting election package, which will be out in a couple of weeks. It's going to look at mail-in ballots, but also looking at polling place closures and all of the issues that are affecting people's ability to vote in election 2020 under these incredibly unique experiences and in the context of the ongoing systemic racism in our country. And I also want to thank our friends at the SNCC Legacy Project for partnering with us. It's so rare to be able to be in a conversation where you can build a strong bridge between the past and present and continue to look at how many of the issues that were won and fought for 20, 40, 50 years ago are still continuing. Or as Latasha, I think you said earlier, the march of democracy continues. So I thank you all for being part of this meaningful conversation. And to those of you who joined us, thank you for hanging in there with us. Please visit our website, publicintegrity.org, and look for our election coverage. I think it'll pick up on so many of the important issues that we've talked about today. So I will just say, until next time, thank you again, wonderful women, and thank you again for joining us. Good evening.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, Susan.